The Pshuto Shel Mikra understanding of the prohibition of V'lifnei Iver lo titen mechshol is not to place a stumbling block in the path of one who is blind. As noted in the previous panels, Rashi reads into this prohibition a prohibition not to give advice that is inappropriate and self-serving to one who is blind, in other words, unaware of the pitfall, and thereby, due to a conflict of interest, the theoretical blind person will suffer a financial loss. The difficulty with Rashi's reading of the text is twofold. Firstly, why does Rashi depart from the Pshuto Shel Mikra, replacing it with a Midrashic layer? And secondly, applying one of the Rebbe's rules regarding the commentary of Rashi that even when drawing from the Midrashic material, the commentary must be justified from within the text, and therefore part 2 of this question is what basis does Rashi have from within the Pshuto Shel Mikra for reading a case of borderline fraud into this pasuk. The MIZRACHI, living 400 years after the death of Rashi, attempts to answer the first part of the difficulty, the why question. He suggests that he does so because it follows a pattern to a commentary that Rashi makes to the opening prohibition of Vayikra 19:14, that of law to kalel cheresh. According to the strict letter of the law, one violates its prohibition if one utters a curse to one who is deaf. Rashi, in his commentary, applies the prohibition, broadening it to the uttering of a curse against any human being with or without hearing. And therefore, Rashi continues this line of thinking into the second prohibition recorded in this pasuk, that regarding the placement of a stumbling block before an iver, one who is blind, one can similarly broaden the prohibition of placing a stumbling block in front of one who is either blind or one who can see. In doing so, we then need to redefine what the stumbling block is to each of the respective situations. The prohibition against cursing another human being is recorded twice in the Chumash. One in Sefer Vayikra 19:14, Lo tekalel cheresh. It also appears earlier in Sefer Shmot as part of the Mishpatim that were delivered following Matan Torah, where Moshe Rabbeinu, in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, commands Elohim lo tekalel. Elohim in this case refers to a judge, that one may not verbally abuse a judge, and v'nasi be'amcha lo ta'or. We noted earlier that the kuf lamed lamed shoreh refers to the act of placing a curse. It also has a connotation of treating somebody who is in a position of authority lightly. This could be applied to the lo tekalel of Shmot 22:27. The aleph resh resh shoresh has a single connotation of pronouncing a curse or verbal abuse, as we find in Sefer Dvarim in connection with the re-establishment of the covenant between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and the people. Representatives of 6 tribes stood upon one mountain, accepted the blessings, while representatives of the other 6 tribes accepted the consequences of violating certain commandments. Arur Ha'ish is the term used to introduce those curses. Shimshon Raphael Hirsch suggests that the Kuf Lamed Lamed reflects an attitude of defiance against authority, Elohim lo tekalel, whereas the Aleph Resh Resh verbal abuse emanates from a source of envy, a desire for power, a wish to replace one who stands as a leader within the community. Rashi, borrowing from the Torah Kahanim, a midrashic source, asks rhetorically, Ein li ela cheresh, regarding the prohibition of lo tekalel. As far as the strict letter of the law is concerned, the prohibition forbids me to curse a cheresh, one who cannot hear. However, as far as the Torah Sheba'al Peh tradition is concerned, the prohibition extends to cursing any human being, and this is reflected in the request, Menayin l'rabot kol adam. What textual basis, if any, is there to expand the prohibition from a cheresh, a non-hearing individual, to everybody else? And the Medrash goes on to provide that source. Talmud Lomar, the text of the Chumash states, Ba'amcha lo ta'or. Ta'or, as we noted, the act of cursing, that one may not curse ba'amcha, anybody that identifies him or herself as part of your community. Which begs the obvious question, Imkain, lama ne'emar cheresh. Why, in Vayikra 19:14, is the prohibition of lo tekalel limited to the cheresh? If it applies to everybody, then the text should have simply read lo tekalel, which then would be aligned with the information recorded in Shmot 22:27. Rashi, based upon the Medrash, reads into the inclusion of the word cheresh a limitation upon this prohibition. Ma cheresh miyuchad shehu b'chayim. Since the word cheresh cannot be taken literally, as it comes into conflict with Shemot 22:27, it is interpreted midrashically and is representative of a person who is alive. That just as one may not place a curse against a cheresh, a living individual, af kol, by extension, the prohibition only applies and is expanded to anybody else, shehu b'chayim, who is alive. In other words, Vayikra 19:14 informs the Ba'amcha of Shemot 22:27, and in doing so, Yatza Hamet. This excludes the situation of cursing one who is no longer alive, she'einu b'chayim, who do not meet the test of the cheresh, who is alive and well. Here, as in most situations of text, we have a tension between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law allows for a looser interpretation of the text material. The Mizrachi argues that just as in the case of the cheresh, Rashi has adopted a spirit of the law interpretation to the law to kalel cheresh. Similarly, with respect to the second prohibition recorded in this very same pasuk, Rashi moves away from the letter of the law, which had limited the prohibition to a physical stumbling block placed in front of one who is physically blind. By the use of midrashic interpretation, he expands the prohibition and reads a metaphorical interpretation into the michshol, the stumbling block, and the iver is understood to be one who is blind to certain conditions that would cause him or her a monetary loss. In this way, the Mizrachi justify the adoption by Rashi of a midrashic interpretation to the lifnei iver lo titen michshol. In peer review style, there are many parshanim who take issue with the thesis of the Mizrachi. Some of those arguments are presented by the Rebbe in the SICHAH.